Hi, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you about three concepts. This is going to be a little bit loose. I want to merely introduce these concepts as frameworks through which I invite us all to think about women and men's experiences of the conquest and colonization of Latin America. We will talk more about this on Thursday, but I invite you to think about how these concepts show up in the readings that you've already done and the readings that you will do for this week. The three pairs are the following. The first is movement and seclusion. The second is honor and shame. And the third is violence and strength. They're not all opposites or dualities necessarily, but they all have a relationship with each other that is shaped by gender, and shaped by gender in particular ways at this time period in the historical context that we're talking about. So first, movement and seclusion. Seclusion was a fundamental value placed on women and not placed on men. What I mean by this is the following, and this is intimately related to the next two, honor and shame. In many ways, it's also related to violence and strength as well. But seclusion, the value of seclusion, which was explicitly about restricting women's movements, but also protecting women from the supposed dangers of the outside world, and also, and this is important, protecting the world from the supposed dangers that women posed to it. And I will say more about why women were thought to pose specific kinds of dangers to society in just a moment. But I want to say something else about seclusion as a word. Seclusion is just the best word that I can come up with to translate recogimiento. Recogimiento, which you don't have to know how to say if you don't speak Spanish, literally translates to seclusion or gathering together in modern day English. In 16th century Spanish, the verb recoger, which means to gather up or to seclude or to bring together, had something like 25 or more definitions. And the word recogimiento, which is the noun version of that word, it means seclusion, you might think of it that way, or cloister is another way to think about it, also had multiple meanings. Lingering for a moment on this word is useful for my purposes today and for our purposes. So recogimiento could mean the act of bringing people together. It almost always in the 16th century was specific to women, however. Recogimiento was also a place, an institution in which women were secluded and brought together. This could be a convent. This could also be other kinds of institutions in which women who are not nuns were brought together for various reasons. These institutions could be voluntary, in which women, supposedly anyways, voluntarily submitted themselves to this kind of seclusion and cloister in order to protect their virtue, in order to protect their reputations. Often poor women, women without parents or at least without fathers, may have voluntarily or semi-voluntarily entered into some of these institutions. These institutions could also be non-voluntary and operated much like prisons. This concept changed radically over the 16th century. The development of all of these kinds of institutions happened in during the 16th century. But in the beginning, the concept of recogimiento was related specifically in Spain to religious seclusion. But very quickly, when the concept was translated to Latin America, it became focused on gendered seclusion, which was certainly related to spirituality and related to concepts of virtue, and could include convents and other religious organizations, but meant even more specifically a way of controlling, protecting, and disciplining often women. So that brings me to the third aspect of this word and the way that it was defined in the 16th century, and that is as a value, which I keep referring to. So recogimiento was something that one possessed, was like a virtue, a quality that someone possessed. Officially, in elite society, well, I don't know if officially is the right word, officially initially, in the early 16th century, to be recogida, to be gathered up, to possess recogimiento as a virtue, meant that you were a woman living in one of these institutions. Eventually, the definition of this started to expand to include also women who were fully secluded in their homes as married women or as virtuous virginal daughters. But it meant literally being secluded inside of something, a house or inside of an institution, and having no contact with outsiders, outside your family, in particular men outside of your family, or if you're in a convent, outside of your confessor, and occasionally a doctor. Over the course of the 16th century, and now this is something that you won't see reflected in the definitions from this time in the historical dictionaries, but you will see it reflected in historical documents. I do a lot of my research with kinds of court documents that very poor women, non-Spanish women, used to present petitions to make complaints, often about violence that they experienced at the hands of men in their families or outside of their families. And in these court documents, you will see poor women who were unwed mothers, who might have been sexually violated, who may have been market women, who had to work outside of the homes. So in other words, women who were not secluded by this elite definition of the word recogimiento, claiming that they had mucho recogimiento, that they had a lot of this quality of seclusion, which came to mean other things. It came to mean a kind of female honor, a kind of female virtue that was very, very gendered, that specifically meant obedient, meant modest. It meant a kind of retiring and gendered performance, we might say, a kind of modest, unassuming, subservient way of being, and complying with the sexual mores of the time. Now, the interesting thing about poor women and women who were unwed mothers saying that they were muy recogida or had mucho recogimiento, that they were very recogida and had a lot of this quality of recogimiento, even though they had obviously had sex outside of marriage, they didn't live in a house secluded from others, they may have had to have worked outside the home, but they were still claiming this virtue, this value, which suggests that it came to mean a way of being a good woman that varied according to geographical and economic life possibilities and circumstances. But however people used the term to describe themselves and how other people used the term to describe women, to describe other women, women using it to describe themselves, and women and men using it to describe other women, it was a value, and it was on this side of a spectrum. Women who had a lot of recogimiento and women who, had none were imagined on this spectrum. Now, all of those women were thought to need a kind of seclusion, however. Women without much recogimiento, prostitutes, women who lived outside of the authority of any men in their lives, women who were loud, women who were rebellious, women who broke rules, gender rules for one reason or another, who were known to create scandal, who were known to have sinned in ways that were publicly recognized, existed on this side of the spectrum, of the least recogimiento, and they were thought to need seclusion for the protection of society. Women who were very recogida were thought to need protection for themselves, and by protecting such women, they could actually sanctify society. They could make society could benefit from their holiness if this virtue was protected. Lack of movement was necessary, in other words, for all women as a rule, as a kind of cultural value, whether they were good women or bad women. And I'll talk a little bit more about, again, why women were thought to represent a threat in a moment, probably in the second video, in which I will talk about shame and honor. But for now, let me just end this video by talking then about the reality of movement. So you probably have noticed from your readings from last week, that movement was a part of everybody's lives in one way or another. Children actually were circulated. Movement between regions because of trade, because of slavery, because of war was common. For most women who were not nuns and who were not very, very wealthy wives, very wealthy daughters, and then very wealthy wives, movement was also a daily reality in their lives. They may have left the home that they grew up in very early and became servants in first one house, then another house. Women moved between institutions, often as servants, in convents and in other kinds of institutions known as recogimientos. So, and women were market women and had to go from house to house selling things, had to travel. Movement was a very common part of everybody's lives, including women. And yet, movement was a value for men. Movement, the ability to move, the ability to travel, was associated with holy war, was associated with learning a trade, was associated with apprenticeship, was associated with taking important governmental posts. Movement, like seclusion for women, was actually a goal for men in many ways. However, movement was actually a reality for women, but one that damaged their reputation if they couldn't avoid it. For those women who could manage to remain secluded and to have their movement restricted, this is represented oftentimes by clothing too, by the ways in which the more beautiful and the more luxurious and the more representative of economic prestige a woman's clothing was, the more restrictive it was of her movements, the more difficult this clothing made women's movements. So women who were nuns or who were very wealthy wives and were able to live inside of homes in both the Iberian Peninsula and later in established colonial society, depended on the movement of other women. And this is really important. Nuns couldn't do what they did. Nuns couldn't live the way that they lived, free of men inside the convent, if it weren't for the reality of all of the female servants and slaves that served convents, that came in and out of the convents all the time, that passed messages, that brought in food, that passed really important messages that allowed nuns to be economically self-sufficient. Nuns were actually extremely wealthy as a whole, as a collective. They owned, they were the biggest landowners in Latin America, not as individuals, but as convents. Even the male authorities of the convents would rely on female servants and slaves to facilitate their entry and exit into just the foyers, just the entranceways of the convents, where they undertook their interviews of the women once a year when they did their visits, their supervising visits. So there's all kinds of ways in which, and also wealthy women who lived properly secluded in their homes had to rely on their servants and on poor market women and women who actually served as go-betweens and circulated in wide ways. And there are other ways in which itinerant priests and itinerant tradesmen also relied on the work of these mobile female servants and slaves to communicate with wealthy women. So we can talk more about that on Thursday, but I want you to keep those two things in mind as you think about how the reality versus the ideal of gendered virtue is shaped around movement and constraint, movement and seclusion, restriction of movement, etc. And now I will stop this video, and then the next video is going to talk about honor and shame in relationship to these things and some other things.